for that, Andy. So as Andy has said, today we are talking about ministry in secular employment and being a minister in secular employment. There is lots of terminology around which we may get tied up with later. Lee, I think you raised last week the difference between worker priests and ministers in secular employment, but we don't want to start off by being too tied up with the terminology. The really important thing to understand is that the essence of ministry in secular employment is that as ministers, we are working in the secular world just like everybody else, and that is where we are looking for signs of God, for signs of Jesus, for signs of the kingdom. And so it very much connects with our session last week about Ignatian spirituality and about finding God in all things. And so what part of what we want to do this evening is to give you an opportunity to think about the secular work that you're either in now or that you have been in the past, and to think about how that might be ministry. But of course, it's much easier to tackle a task like that if you've heard a little bit about what it means for other people. So more of that later. Just before I asked Phil to introduce himself, though, I thought it might be helpful, because I don't know this group too well, or I don't know the whole group, just to see how many people are currently in secular employment rather than being stipendiary or perhaps retired. So if you're currently in some form of secular employment, would you like to stick your hand up? So I reckon that is John and Penny and Cheryl and Sarah and Paul and Lizzie, and I've forgotten to stick my hand up, and Sade. Okay, so maybe half or so of us. That's lovely. Okay, Phil, without any more ado, would you like to introduce yourself to us and tell us a little bit about your secular work and what that looks like?
Thank you. I hope you're sorry about this. First of all, thank you for the invitation with you all. So I'm getting echo.
Yeah, if you mute yourself on that, we're not going to hear you, I think. Yeah, if you try turning your video off, Phil, that might help too. But you're muted, and if not, okay. Father Lee, you've got your hand up. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, thanks, Marianne. I appreciate it's a slight, this would cause a slight, but only hopefully minor disruption, that we move to Google Meets. If Andy has to hand the email list of participants, the group can be emailed a link to Google Meets, which is a much more reliable and better quality platform than Zoom. But I appreciate that requires administration and may not be helpful, but I find it a much more reliable, better quality platform than Zoom, in case that helps.
I'm now back on the phone, and I don't believe on visual Zoom.
Brilliant. Well, we can hear you in that case, Phil.
And I can hear you.
Let's go with it this way.
Yeah, I'll continue in that case.
Okay.
So,
sorry about the delay.
You were about to tell us your story in terms of work.
Yes, I will. So first of all, we echo my thanks for having me despite my technical incompetence. But here I am. My story begins when I was sent to Sunday school when I was 6. And I sort of grew up in church doing churchy stuff. I went off to university and studied chemical engineering. If there are any other chemical engineers in the room, you will understand. If you're a chemist, chemists do test tubes. chemical engineers do it in huge reactors. And my career since graduation had been in the chemical industries, working variously, initially as a chemical engineer, designing, building, commissioning chemical plants of various sorts. And I then moved into the area of process safety. Now, process safety is not people falling off ladders, but working with people to try and avoid major hazards, things like fires, explosion, and environmental incidents. That was my job and continued to be my job. Eventually, I pursued a call to ordination, triggered, in fact, by a suggestion that I'd simply take a Harvard MBA. It forced a decision point, shall I say. Just checking everybody can hear me still?
Yeah.
Yeah,
all
this is
well.
working well.
Good.
Thank you.
Good. So I made this decision to pursue ordination. And from the outset, I was quite clear that I was not going to leave the world of work to, quote unquote, go into the church, which I think is an awful expression. At this stage, I had never heard the term MSE. But having started training, I met other MSEs and found that you could do this. One of my first encounters with a worker priest, and as Marianne says, we'll clarify terms later, was when I was invited to a weekend meeting. And I met a guy settling now departed called John Sherrington, who was a passionist priest, working in London for the London Borough of Hackney as a street cleaner. And we talked, as we are doing now, about what we did in our work. And I was young, naive, and enthusiastic. So I said, so John, what do you do as a priest? I clean the streets of London. No, I said, what do you do as a priest? I clean the streets of London. The penny dropped and I shut up. And that's the challenging model that I've had before me all the way through. So the day after I was ordained, I returned to the same job and my same desk. Since then, I've been employed in a chemical company. Actually, at the time of my ordination, I was in a small business unit, which was which had a real sense of community. I then moved into a consultancy firm and latterly have been working as a self-employed consultant. What is interesting is that that career path reflects the path that many people now follow and really does reflect the changes in the patterns of work for many people in this country. Latterly, my actual work has been running training courses in process safety and leading safety studies for operating companies in countries worldwide of all sorts of industries. I have worked in everything from oil and gas, pharmaceuticals, heavy chemicals. I've even done dog food and coffee making. It's been a very varied career. Marianne, that's probably enough about me.
Thank you very much, Phil. That's great. So I'm aware that some people on the call will know me quite well. Some of you have had the misfortune or otherwise of hearing me go on about MSE as we've travelled through Curacy together. Other people don't know me so well, so I thought it'd be helpful probably to say a little bit about my story as well. So I was a high flyer in a traditional school with not much careers advice, where the expectations were fairly traditional, really. So I ended up training as a doctor. And that was partly a reflection of the fact that my school didn't do careers advice. They assumed the high flyers would do medicine or law and go to Oxbridge, so I did. But it was also for me at the time something like Phil, I grew up in a Christian family, and I had prayed about what my path was and what God wanted me to do. So that was actually a vocational decision for me. But while I was a medical student and as a junior doctor, I was quite unhappy. And so I was kind of thinking about what I was going to be doing. I took some time out from medicine at a point when I was thinking that maybe I should be looking for a different career. I went and lived with a bunch of nuns for about 18 months. If any of you have seen Call the Midwife, the community that I lived with is the community that was based in. And then I found myself having not just lived with a bunch of nuns, but actually done a lot of work with a secular career management agency during that time. I found myself beginning to train in psychiatry. And so that was really my second point of kind of vocational decision making, that within medicine, I headed for psychiatry. And that was a niche that suited me very well. So I got on with doing my training as a doctor, developing particular interests in different areas of psychiatry. I spent a bit of time doing research. And along the way, I got married. I had a higher training post. I started a family. And my career was progressing and I was getting on with life. And then when I was about 10 years into my consultant post, living in Romford with my family, I was at a point in my career where I was sort of reviewing things again, fine-tuning what I was doing, working with a career management agency again. And somebody suggested to me that I should pursue ordination. And I then had a period when, both from a kind of traditional vocational perspective from the church, but also the work that I was doing with this career management agency, I was kind of exploring vocation from both secular and church perspectives, really. And in that process, I met with the person who was at the time, and actually still is, the Dean of SSM Ministry in Chelmsford Diocese. And I heard about the theology of ministry and secular employment. And for me, that very much resonated and it made a lot of sense to me. And then when I finished my career review, that really had two outcomes for me. The first one was that it affirmed absolutely what I was doing in terms of psychiatry and the teaching role I had within that and a lot of my choices within that. But it also suggested that I might be a very good idea if I explored the discernment process within the church. So I thought I better do that. But right from the beginning, I was clear that my calling was not to parish ministry, but it was to ministry and secular employment, to be in the workplace, to be carrying on with the vocation that I already had as a psychiatrist. I've said to a lot of people along the way that it wasn't a career change, it was a career addition, which probably shows just how bonkers I am. But within that, I took a relatively unusual path in that most MSCs would train part-time on a course, but I was clear that I wanted to do residential training. So I took a career break from my NHS job, and my family and I moved up to Yorkshire and spent a couple of years there, during which I was both training full-time at Murfield, and I was also maintaining my license to practice. I was doing CPD for my psychiatric work, and generally running around like a mad thing. And then when I was ordained, I returned to the team that I'd been working in prior to ordination training. And then about 6 months later, I moved into what I would now describe really as my incumbency, in that it's where I see myself as being long-term exercising my ministry with the team that I'm now in, working with adults with eating disorders. So that's a little bit about me. And as Andy said, I'm still just about a curate in the diocese. So you've heard a little bit about Phil and you've heard a little bit about me and what our jobs look like, but it's probably about time that we talked a little bit more about ministry and secular employment and worker priests and how those two fit together. So Phil, I wonder if you could perhaps give us a little bit of the history and the theology of MSE, please.
Thanks, Marianne. Clearly there is a lot of detail here, and this is only going to be a quick overview. If anybody wants to explore more, do get in touch with us afterwards. But I go back, first of all, to the French. There was a history of French chaplains going with captured forces and civilians into prisoners of war camps in World War II, which obviously put them in contact with, if I may use the expression, ordinary working people. That led to a move within France of priests being sent to work in manual labour, to be with the workers alongside them, living their lives and sharing the same situations. The key phrase that often recurs among the French and others, if you'll forgive my French accent, is simply être avec, to be with, be alongside. What happened was that these priests working in labouring industries, mines, shipyards, heavy industries, factories, became politicised, radicalised, and unionised. The Church of Rome got nervous about this, and so they were banned in 1954. I actually have a copy of the interdiction letter. And they were not reinstated until after the Second Vatican Council in 1968. And in fact, I attended a grand 50th anniversary celebration of the reinstatement in Paris back in 2018. Other countries in Europe followed suit. There were worker priests in Italy, Spain, Belgium, Germany. And at this time, of course, they were male worker priests. The UK learnt from what was going on in mainland Europe. There was an early group of worker priests centred around Oxford, but more diverse than that, who followed this French model. There was a particularly famous person called Tony Williamson, now also sadly dead, who worked in a car factory, driving a forklift truck in Cowley. He was very much part of a first wave, and I didn't get to know about the existence of that group until some later stage in my own career. Also learning from Europe, Southwark Diocese, under Mervyn Stockwood, started the Southwark Ordination Course, which is also celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. And the purpose of the Southwark Ordination Course was to train people part-time to stay in work and stay in their jobs. A key difference, which we often encounter when we're speaking to our European colleagues, is that most of us in the UK are in professional level jobs rather than shop floor. We have had many heated discussions about whether we are close enough to ordinary working people. A key step in the development of MSE, Ministry in Secular Employment as a concept, was a conference in Nottingham in 1984, called by one individual, Michael Rankin, with help from others, to which he invited all those, what we would now call self-supporting ministers, who might have an interest in this way of working. From that conference, a network was formed for ministers in work. And this led eventually to the organisation that Marianne and I are both part of. I don't think we've mentioned CRISM, Christians in Secular Ministry, which was founded in 1994. Following Southwark, as has probably been the experience of many of you, other local non-residential training courses were started, and these have changed and amalgamated over the years. Now, I realise I've been talking very Anglican to an Anglican audience, but there are also URC ministers in secular posts, and there are Methodist sector ministers similarly engage in secular careers. And we've also spent a lot of time working with lay readers, lay ministers, and Roman Catholic deacons, many of whom work and therefore have a ministry in work. So that's a rather brief overview, but I hope it gives you a feel.
I think you've done a masterpiece there, Phil, in giving us a lot of material in a fairly short space of time. Thank you very much. We thought we'd turn now to looking at a Bible passage which we think picks up on some of the themes that are particularly interesting for ministers in secular employment. I don't know whether anybody has got a Bible to hand and would like to read this for us. It's John chapter 21, verses 1 to 13. Would anybody like to read that? Distinct lack of enthusiasm there. Okay, I'll read it then.
Yeah, Marianne, if you give me a minute, I can get a Bible.
Go for it, Cheryl. Means you get to hear somebody's voice other than mine. I should have said at the beginning when we were all settling down that'd be useful if somebody had one. So it's John 21, verses 1 to 13.
Okay. Jesus appears to 7 disciples. That's my heading. After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, and he showed himself in this way. Gathered there together were Simon Peter, Thomas, called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 others of his disciples. Simon Peter said to them, I am going fishing. They said to him, we will go with you. They went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Just after daybreak, Jesus stood on the beach, but the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to them, children, you have no fish, have you? They answered him, no. He said to them, cast the net to the right side of the boat and you will find some. So they cast it, and now they were not able to haul it in because there were so many fish. That disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, it is the Lord. When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on some clothes, for he was naked, and jumped into the lake. But the other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far from the land, only about 100 yards off. When they had gone ashore, they saw a charcoal fire there with fish on it and bread. Jesus said to them, bring some of the fish that you have just caught. So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore, full of large fish, 153 of them. And though there were not so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, come and have breakfast. Now none of the disciples dared to ask him, who are you? Because they knew it was the Lord. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. Last one, or is that okay?
That's fine, thank you. Thank you very much. So why have we chosen that passage? Well, firstly, of course, we're still in Eastertide and it's one of the resurrection appearances. So that seemed like a good starting point. But more importantly, in this passage, we see how the disciples, after all of the trauma of Easter and all of the ups and downs of that, what do? They go back to what they know. They go back to fishing as fishermen. And what happens there? They meet the risen Jesus. And not only do they meet Jesus, but actually their encounter with Jesus transforms their experience of the work, that whereas they've been working fruitlessly all night, suddenly they can catch fish aplenty. And in that context, they share a meal with Jesus. So they're sharing fellowship with one another and with him in the context of the work. And that seems like a pretty good passage for somebody who's thinking about their ministry in secular employment. Do you want to add anything to that, Phil?
No, that's a masterful summary as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so you've heard a fair amount of talking from us now. What we'd now like to do is to give you some time to think a little bit about the kind of themes that we've started to raise. So we're going to give you about a quarter of an hour. And what we'd like you to think about predominantly is what you either do or did pre-ordination in your work. You might like to start off by thinking a little bit about that passage and what that tells us about encountering God in your work. But what we really want you to think about now is not the ministry stuff, not the holy stuff, but just actually, what is your work? What is it that you do? Who are you working with? If you were talking to somebody outside the church, what kinds of things would you be saying? What are you actually doing? What's the nature of your work itself? Because that's the starting point. If you're in secular work right now, that's great. That's easy. If you're not, if all of your working time right now is in the church, well, you're probably a curate, so it's probably not very long since you were in the workplace. Similarly, if you're retired, do think back to where it was, what work you were doing. And of course, remember that this is the daily working world, is the life for most of the people in your congregation. So even if you as a stipendiary minister are moving away from spending most of your time in the secular working world, this is the kind of thing that is the bread and butter of life for the people that you are ministering to. I will put in the chat what the task is. It's just simply to think about what I do or did in my work. You've got about a quarter of an hour. So where are we? It's 19:49 now. So if we say we'll come back at 8:05, feel free to put your camera off, to think, to doodle, but just to think about those issues. And we will be building on that later. So you might find it useful to have jotted some things down that you can use later on. Any questions, or is that all reasonably clear? Great. See you again at 8:05 then.